When Margaret returned from the care center, the outside world had changed. But what she didn't expect was the quiet storm building, an undercurrent rising from complete strangers who had never met her. An anonymous media campaign began to spread across social media. It started with a few shared posts, then images, stories, and short videos. But they all had one thing in common: the face of Margaret Taylor, accompanied by the caption, "My mother isn't crazy. She was betrayed." No one knew who started the campaign. Some said it was a former employee from Willow Pines. Others believed it was one of the elderly residents who lived in the facility with Margaret, who, after hearing her story, passed it along to their children and grandchildren. Wherever it began, the wave spread like wildfire. Public opinion began to stir, raising questions. Why would a mother be placed in a psychiatric facility by her son just after inheriting money from her late husband? If she's truly incapacitated, how did she manage to hire a lawyer to oppose that decision? And if she really has a problem, why did she return to normal just months later and regain all her assets? These weren't just questions. They were the first cracks in the image Brandon had spent years building. A young, serious, educated, and successful businessman, now tied to the label son who betrayed his own mother to steal her fortune. Legal analysis articles began to surface. Are there loopholes in the guardianship system? Who has the authority to declare someone incompetent? When greed outweighs maternal love, what does the Margaret Taylor case reveal? From a personal story, Margaret had become a symbol for a much larger issue: the rights of the elderly within the U.S. legal system. Are they truly protected, or are they just names that can be discarded when no one stands by their side? Amidst the public storm, a name appeared on lawyer Aaron's phone screen: Pamela Ross, a veteran journalist from the prestigious magazine The Atlantic. Her voice was calm yet firm.
I don't want sensationalism. I want the truth from Mrs. Margaret. Is it possible to arrange a meeting?
Aaron was silent for a few seconds before replying.
I'll ask her, but I must warn you, she's been hurt deeply and she trusts no one.
The call ended. But Aaron knew one thing for sure. This was a turning point. If Margaret agreed to speak out, she wouldn't just tell her story. She would ignite a nationwide conversation. That night, Aaron went to Margaret's house, where she was staying with an old college friend. She was making tea, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes sharp. When Aaron spoke about the offer from journalist Pamela Ross, she sat in silence for a long time. Finally, she said just one sentence.
If I don't speak, then who will speak for mothers like me?
The next day, in a quiet cafe, Margaret sat across from Pamela Ross. The interview wasn't filmed, only audio recordings and notes were made. There was no script, no conditions, just the truth. Margaret spoke about the son she had once trusted completely. About the moment she was placed in the facility, stripped of her honor, her freedom, and her voice. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She spoke in the slow, steady tone of someone who had lived, suffered, and was standing up. At the end of the interview, Pamela took her hand gently and said,
I can't promise this article will change the world, but I promise it will make them listen.
Weeks later, the article titled "The Mother Left Behind: The American Story They Don't Want to Talk About" was published. Within 48 hours, it became the most shared article of the year on the magazine's platform. Calls started pouring in, not just from readers, but from organizations, lawmakers, and other elderly individuals who had also been stripped of their rights. The small cafe sat tucked away in a quiet corner of the city's outskirts. Margaret chose a seat by the window, the early morning sunlight casting a soft glow through the glass, highlighting her graying hair. Across from her sat Pamela Ross, an experienced journalist known for exposing shocking stories about women's rights and minorities. Today, she didn't bring a camera, no team of reporters, just a conversation between two women and a notebook. Margaret looked at Pamela, sighed.
I don't want to become a permanent victim in the eyes of others, but I can't stay silent forever.
The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. Margaret told everything, from when her husband died, leaving behind a large sum of money, to when her son Brandon offered to help manage the assets, then secretly transferred everything into his own name. She described the sham meeting at the court, where Brandon claimed his mother was mentally incompetent, without any independent doctors to verify it. Margaret hadn't known a thing until the police arrived at her house with a court order. At the Willow Pines Care Center, she lived like a shadow. No phone calls, no letters, no autonomy. She screamed, wrote petitions, begged, but everything was ignored because the legal guardian requested it. That guardian was none other than Brandon. "I'm not crazy, Pamela. I was betrayed." Pamela nodded, her gaze no longer that of a reporter, but of a daughter, listening to the voice of a mother. However, there was one thing Margaret didn't say, something she kept to herself: the lottery win. For her, money didn't matter as much as the theft of her autonomy and trust. After the interview, Margaret made one request.
Please don't use my real name. I'm not ready for an open battle, but I want the story to be told.
Pamela agreed. She wrote the article under the title, Mother or Millionaire? The Silencing of Margaret T. The article was published 2 days later. No images, no full name, just quotes, details, and truths presented as a real story, one that couldn't be ignored. Within hours, the article caused an uproar. Social media platforms exploded with hashtags Margaret T and Had Justice for Seniors. Thousands of comments poured in, from people whose loved ones had been placed in care facilities without explanation, to lawyers, doctors, and social activists. A wave of anger spread. How many Margarets are out there that we don't know about? How can someone's right to live be taken away just because of a paper signed by a relative? This is America, not a re-education camp. Amidst the public storm, an unexpected move occurred. The U.S. Department of Justice officially announced they had received an anonymous file, including legal documents, recorded conversations, and a copy of the complaint, all related to the case of Margaret T. While the identity of the sender remained undisclosed, the file was detailed enough to open an official investigation into potential guardianship abuse and organized asset fraud. Aaron, Margaret's lawyer, was the one who helped her prepare the file. And he knew, once the government was involved, this was no longer just Margaret's fight. It was a warning to anyone who had ever exploited the silence of the elderly, thinking age was the end of justice. Margaret received the news in silence. She didn't celebrate. She simply poured herself a cup of tea and gazed out the window.
It's not over, she whispered, but at least this time they're listening.
The second trial had arrived, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was more tense than ever. Brandon sat in the defendant's chair, staring at the floor with a clear look of worry. Since Margaret's case was made public, his support had started to crumble. Information about financial fraud and his abuse of guardianship to seize his mother's assets had gradually been revealed. Every accusation from insiders, from senior advocacy organizations, further diminished Brandon's credibility. Public opinion had shifted. No one was standing by Brandon anymore. Instead, he was criticized as a criminal, a betrayer of his own mother. Former friends turned their backs on him, and colleagues in the financial industry began to avoid him. Every word from Brandon now lacked conviction. All eyes were on him, as if he were the defendant in this case, not Margaret. Aaron, Margaret's lawyer, entered the courtroom with confidence. He had prepared everything meticulously. Despite the tense atmosphere, he knew he held a winning card. When called to present, Aaron stood up and began to introduce the independent psychological report he had gathered.
Your Honor, we have a psychological report from a specialist who evaluated Margaret's mental health. The report shows that she is fully alert, has clear cognitive awareness, and is fully capable of making decisions. She is not mentally incompetent as claimed. Additionally, we have solid financial evidence proving that Margaret not only has control over her assets, but also fully understands the financial decisions being made.
Your Honor, we have a psychological report from a specialist who evaluated Margaret's mental health. The report shows that she is fully alert, has clear cognitive awareness, and is fully capable of making decisions. She is not mentally incompetent as claimed. Additionally, we have solid financial evidence proving that Margaret not only has control over her assets, but also fully understands the financial decisions being made.
With the support of such strong evidence, Aaron's confidence grew. He also presented the fact that Brandon was under federal investigation for fraud and identity theft. Documents showed he had used Margaret's personal information to open bank accounts and withdraw money from her accounts without her consent. These actions had sparked public outrage, and authorities had begun an official investigation into Brandon's illegal activities. The courtroom fell silent. Aaron's serious accusations forced everyone to reconsider the truth that had been hidden for so many years. The psychologist who was called to testify confirmed that Margaret was fully lucid. She had clear awareness of everything around her and was completely capable of making decisions regarding her assets and life. The psychologist also emphasized that Margaret showed no signs of illness or cognitive decline. Facing all the charges, Brandon could no longer maintain his previous composure. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. The public's gaze, Aaron's questions, and the truth being laid bare left him unable to defend himself. His words became vague, illogical, and unconvincing. Finally, Margaret had the opportunity to face her son directly in the courtroom. When Brandon's name was called, she stood up from her seat and walked forward. Her gaze was quiet, but filled with resolve. In that moment, she looked at Brandon and asked a question that needed no answer.
I am the one who raised you, so why did you do this to your own mother?
Brandon lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. That question struck him like a dagger to the heart. His crimes were now exposed to the light. There was no way out. After hearing the arguments and evidence from both sides, the judge made the final decision.
With the clear evidence and testimonies presented, the court rejects Brandon's petition. Margaret Taylor will have her full personal and financial rights restored. All current decisions regarding her assets and health must be fully respected.
The judge's declaration echoed, and in that moment, all the pressure seemed to lift off Margaret's shoulders. She had won, but this victory was not the result of hostility or hatred. It was the result of resilience, courage, and a truth that could not be hidden. After the trial, Margaret's life did not return to what it once was. After years of living under control and deceit, she had finally reclaimed ownership of her life. But while winning in court was something to celebrate, she knew a long journey still lay ahead. More than anything, Margaret didn't want to be just another legal victor. She wanted to speak out, to share her story. A story of betrayal, of a mother deceived, and of a fight not just for her own rights, but for the rights of countless other seniors in society. Not long after the court's ruling, the Department of Justice officially filed charges against Brandon for financial fraud, deception, and identity theft. The media picked up the story rapidly. Margaret's journey, from betrayal by her son to regaining her freedom and dignity, became a central topic of national conversation. Public attention turned to her. But despite the support of elder rights organizations, Margaret chose to remain silent for 2 days. She needed time to process everything that had happened and decide what her next steps would be. But the silence didn't last long. She realized she had the power to bring about real change if she spoke up, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a call to action against the crimes so often hidden in plain sight. Margaret ultimately decided to meet again with journalist Sarah, the same reporter who had followed her story when her world had turned upside down. This time, she hid nothing. With unwavering resolve, Margaret chose to tell the full truth of everything she had endured.
I wasn't just deceived by my own son. I was misjudged by society and the people around me. But I can't stay silent any longer. My story is the story of millions. I can't stand by while we continue to witness the elderly being exploited and abused.
Margaret shared in the interview. She recounted every detail. The nursing home where she had been placed without her consent, the winning lottery ticket Brandon stole and never told her about, and the bank accounts he secretly controlled, draining funds without permission. Margaret also revealed the documents she had submitted to the Department of Justice, which proved Brandon's fraudulent activities. With every word, people began to realize that Margaret's story was not just a personal account, but a reflection of a much larger social issue. The financial manipulation, the stripping of personal agency, and the abuse of her identity for criminal gain all exposed a systemic problem. Her case sparked a national conversation about the vulnerability of the elderly in today's world. The next day, the interview aired. Millions of viewers from around the world tuned in to hear her story. The public response was overwhelming. Messages of support flooded social media, and similar stories from others began to emerge. Margaret had become a symbol of strength and resilience in the fight for justice. People no longer saw her merely as a betrayed mother. She became a role model for anyone fighting for truth, for justice, and for the dignity of the elderly. Her story gave hope to those suffering in silence and courage to those too afraid to speak. Most of all, Margaret became a pioneer for meaningful change in how society protects and respects its seniors. In the end, Margaret didn't just reclaim her life, she helped millions of others find the strength to stand up and demand the respect and rights they truly deserved. Margaret didn't stop at reclaiming her own rights. After winning a long and grueling legal battle, she realized that the fight to protect the elderly from financial and legal abuse was far from over. She didn't want to be just a media figure. She wanted to create real, lasting change. Not just for herself, but for everyone who might find themselves in her position. And so, the Margaret Project was born. This initiative, bearing her name, was founded with a clear but ambitious goal: to support elderly individuals who have suffered abuse, and to protect them from financial exploitation and legal manipulation by those closest to them. Margaret understood that this was not just a legal issue. It was a deeply rooted social one that demanded awareness and action. Her project quickly gained attention from both government agencies and the public, especially as cases of elder fraud and financial manipulation became increasingly common. Margaret began organizing seminars, launching training programs for elder caregivers, and offering free legal resources to those struggling to defend their rights. She collaborated with nonprofits, government bodies, and private companies to build a strong network of support for the most vulnerable members of society. While Margaret's project was growing stronger every day, Brandon's life crumbled completely. Following the charges of fraud and deception, he was officially prosecuted. His case became a textbook example of how power and trust within families can be tragically misused. Brandon lost his reputation, old friends turned away, and no one in the family wanted to stand by him anymore. He became a cautionary tale, an embodiment of what greed and betrayal could lead to. One day, Margaret received a photograph from Brandon, an old picture of the two of them at a joyful family gathering, accompanied by a handwritten apology filled with remorse. He wrote that he regretted everything he had done and hoped for her forgiveness. But for Margaret, those words couldn't undo the damage he had caused. The photo was nothing more than a ghost from a past she no longer wished to carry. As she held the photo, a powerful resolve rose within her. Margaret didn't need Brandon's apology to heal. She had already survived the pain and proven she was stronger than anything he had done to her. So she chose not to keep the photo, not to let it linger as a painful relic of her past. Margaret burned it, freeing herself from the weight of those memories. As the flames consumed the image, she felt a cleansing, a release from the sorrow, betrayal, and pain that had once burdened her life. That moment was more than just a personal act. It became a symbol of rebirth, of the power Margaret had reclaimed from those who had wronged her. In that instant, she felt truly free, no longer haunted by the past, no longer tethered to the people who had tried to break her. She had emerged from the shadows and was now shaping a brighter future. Through the Margaret Project, she not only offered aid to those who had been abused, but she helped them realize that they were not powerless victims. Older adults were not weak, disposable members of society. They had power, a voice, and a right to be respected. Margaret had found her purpose, and she committed to using the rest of her life to fight for a more just world for the elderly. Margaret's story was no longer just the journey of a mother betrayed. It became a message to us all, that strength isn't always about winning battles. Sometimes, true strength comes from the courage to rise, to rebuild, and to lead change after being pushed to the very edge of despair. After everything she had endured, Margaret made the decision to return to the place that had once felt like her prison, Willow Pines Nursing Home. It was there, in those dark days, that she had been confined while her own family exploited her vulnerability to impose control and manipulation. But now, after her hard-fought legal victory, Margaret's life had completely transformed. And this time she returned not as a victim, but as a resilient mother, a warrior, and a symbol of recovery. Willow Pines, once a place of quiet despair, now welcomed her as a hero. The residents, many of whom had witnessed Margaret's suffering, now looked at her with admiration and deep respect. The atmosphere had changed completely. What was once a cold and forgotten care facility had become a space filled with hope and transformation. On the day of her return, Margaret wasn't just someone who had won a lawsuit. She had become an inspiration. The people of Willow Pines, many of whom had long been treated as burdens to society, now saw themselves reflected in her story. Margaret understood them better than anyone. She knew what it felt like to be abandoned, overlooked, and diminished simply because of age. But now she stood before them to share a message. No matter how forgotten they might feel, they still mattered. They were not alone. Their lives were not over. In a moving speech to the residents of Willow Pines, Margaret stood at a podium, her eyes shining with determination. She said,
"You are not a burden, you are not forgotten, and you are not finished."
Those words echoed through the room, touching the hearts of everyone present. Elderly residents, many of whom had felt cast aside by society, now felt seen, respected, and valued. Margaret had found a way not only to save herself, but to extend a hand to others suffering in silence and injustice. As she spoke, it wasn't only the residents who were moved. Nurses, caregivers, and visiting family members all felt the weight and power of her message. Margaret was no longer just a betrayed mother. She was a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever felt discarded. She stood as proof that no matter your age or circumstance, you deserve a life filled with purpose, dignity, and love. This was no ordinary reunion. It was the closing of a cycle of pain, neglect, and silence that was now giving way to a new beginning of hope, healing, and advocacy. Margaret was no longer the frail woman society had tried to define. She was a strong, victorious leader. But more than that, she was someone who had found her purpose, to ensure that others, especially the elderly, would no longer be trapped in suffering and silence. In this moment, Margaret realized that real change doesn't only come from legal wins or media recognition. It comes from making people feel seen, valued, and empowered. Her return to Willow Pines wasn't just a homecoming. It was a rebirth. A symbol that no one should suffer alone or fade away in silence. She had closed her own circle, but a new one had just begun. A circle of liberation, of restoration, and most importantly, of respect for the elderly. This was the gift she now offered, to those still hurting and to those who had yet to speak their truth. The final day of the legal battle had arrived. After everything she had endured, Margaret felt a deep sense of relief settle in her heart. All along, she hadn't just been fighting for justice. She had been fighting for something even more precious: freedom. Not freedom from court orders or legal restraints, but freedom from the emotional weight others had placed on her shoulders. And now she understood that letting go was not a sign of defeat, but a powerful step toward reclaiming herself. A second letter from Brandon arrived, but this time, Margaret felt no urge to open it. Part of her didn't want to read any more hollow apologies. The other part knew she could no longer allow anyone, especially him, to manipulate her emotions. She had once loved her son with all her heart, but that love had been exploited, twisted into a weapon to control and hurt her. Now she saw clearly that love, when not met with respect, ceases to be love. Margaret chose not to open the letter. She made the conscious decision to deny anyone the power to make her feel small again. Instead of dwelling on shadows from the past, Margaret chose to face herself. She decided to write a letter, not to Brandon or to the court, but to herself. Picking up a pen, she began to write line by line, acknowledging the worth she had neglected for far too long. She wrote about what she had endured, what she had learned, and, most importantly, what she had reclaimed from those who had tried to break her. That letter wasn't just filled with words of comfort. It was a declaration of her strength and her newfound freedom. She wrote,
"You are not weak, you simply loved too deeply, and when they tried to rewrite your story, you picked up the pen and wrote your own ending."
Those words carried weight. They weren't just soothing thoughts. They were a manifesto of self-ownership and defiance. As Margaret read over her letter, there was no more pain, only peace. She had truly found release. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about making anyone pay. It was about reclaiming her identity and self-worth. The transformation she experienced wasn't to prove something to Brandon or to anyone else. It was simply about ending a long cycle of control and grief, and beginning a new story, one she authored herself. That letter wasn't only for Margaret. It was for anyone who had ever been silenced, abused, or used. It was a reminder that we all have the power to rewrite our story, not with hatred or vengeance, but with courage and self-determination. As Margaret stepped out of the courthouse, she was no longer the broken woman others had once seen. She was a warrior who had overcome those who tried to take everything from her. And now, she was more than just a legal victor. She was a woman who had learned to forgive herself and reclaim her freedom. She chose not to live in bitterness, but to move forward with meaning. Margaret's battle had never just been with Brandon. It was a battle with the limits she had unknowingly accepted about herself, and in that letter to her own soul, she completed her liberation. She hadn't merely closed a chapter. She had opened a new one where she could live with dignity, freedom, and no longer be haunted by the shadows of the past. With everything she had gained, she now understood a powerful truth. Freedom is not something others can grant you. It is something you must claim for yourself. And Margaret had done exactly that. Not through revenge, but through the quiet strength of forgiveness and healing.